Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees have taken their seat on the chair of Moses. Therefore do and observe all things whatsoever they tell you, but do not follow their example. For they preach, but they do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens hard to carry and lay them on people's shoulders, but they will not lift a finger to move them. All their works are performed to be seen. They widen their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels. They love places of honor at banquets, seats of honor in synagogues, greetings in marketplaces, and the salutation, Rabbi. As for you, do not be called Rabbi. You have but one teacher, and you are all brothers. Call no one on earth your father. You have but one Father in heaven. Do not be called master. You have but one master, Christ. The greatest among you must be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but whoever humbles himself will be exalted." The Gospel of the Lord. One of the most common verses from the Bible that is quoted by Christians who are not Catholic as they quote this passage from Matthew 23 to Catholics. "Call no one on earth your father. You have but one Father in heaven." Right? And say, look at you Catholics, you call your priests fathers. You're obviously disobeying the command of Jesus. And a great response when people ask that is to say, well, you are too, because you haven't cut off your right hand or plucked out your eye, right? Jesus also says that if your hand causes you to sin, you should cut it off. If your eye causes you to sin, you should pluck it out, right? Obviously, there are times in the Bible where Jesus exaggerates. And this is one of those times that he is exaggerating. We can be sure of this because elsewhere in the New Testament, St. Paul himself refers to himself as a father to various people. He says that Timothy has become his son in the Lord. Same way with Onesimus, who is the main character of the letter to Philemon or Philemon, depending on how you like to pronounce it. Right? So St. Paul himself obviously did not have any issues with referring to himself as a spiritual father. Right? And so we should not either. The point that Jesus is making here is that those who are in positions of authority should not be lording it over the people who they are in charge of. Christ says the greatest among you must be your servant. This is significant because in the church we talk about a virtue called obedience. You are to be obedient to your pastor, and priests are to be obedient to their bishop, right? And bishops are to be obedient to the pope, etc., etc. Right? All of this talk about obedience. When priests are ordained, one of the promises they make is obedience to the bishop and to his successor. Many of you are parents, right? You desire that your children be obedient to you. What Christ is actually articulating here is that obedience is a two-way street. He's telling those in religious authority that the greatest among them must be the servant of all. That's how obedience works. It's not simply those who are under the person in authority who need to be obedient to that person. The person in authority also has to be a servant. And in that sense, that person has obligations to fulfill to the people under him. Obedience is a two-way street. That's the point that Jesus is making here. Because unfortunately in his day, many of the Pharisees and Sadducees, they desired that people tithe. They desired that people followed their teachings. But they themselves laid heavy burdens upon their disciples and did not do anything to assist them. They were not being obedient in that sense to the obligations they had towards the people under them. Something else that is kind of interesting about this passage is about this phrase about the chair of Moses. So Jesus says that even though the Pharisees, even though they are hypocritical, he tells his disciples that they should still follow their teachings because they sit on the chair of Moses. Literally, the Greek word there is the cathedra of Moses. You might be familiar with Catholics when we talk about the authority of the Pope, when we talk about his infallibility. We say that he is infallible, not all the time, but when he speaks from his cathedra, when he makes an explicit, infallible teaching statement, clarifying some point of doctrine. We say that he speaks from the cathedra, the chair. We didn't just make this up. It comes from the Bible. Even in the days of Jesus and ancient Judaism, they had this idea that certain people who had been instilled with authority, even though they were not perfect persons, still there were certain times when they were teaching from the chair, that they had a certain authority that goes with that. And we've carried that over into Catholicism today. All of us, whether we still have children at home or anybody else who we are involved with, right? These words are still very applicable to us. The greatest among you must be your servant. The quickest way to holiness is service. It is the lightening of the burdens of others. And we all know people in our lives, in our family circles or friend circles, who have immense burdens that they are carrying. And the quickest way to holiness is to ease those burdens. It should be a part of our prayer every single day. Who is the person today whose burden I can lessen? Who can I assist this day? The greatest among you must be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted.